The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will come to order. We are still waiting for Mr. Doyle to come, but in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and begin, and I recognize myself for 3 minutes for an opening statement. And I do want to welcome each of you here. We are pleased to arrive at this day and to mark up the discussion draft of the FCC Reauthorization Act. At the beginning of this Congress, we made clear that a priority of this committee would be reauthorizing agencies within our jurisdiction. Today, we start with the Federal Communications Commission, an agency that has not been reauthorized in 25 years. The appropriation level when the commission was last authorized was $109 million. Today, it is over $430 million, yet the agency's authorizing statute has not been revisited. The FCC is charged with the administration of the Communications Act and other statutes that govern our country's communications policy. The agency plays an increasingly important role as society becomes more dependent on technology, and the authorizing statute needs to be updated to reflect the current state of the communications marketplace. This subcommittee held an FCC oversight hearing in July, during which the subcommittee discussed the need to reauthorize the agency. Since that time, staff, both Democrat and Republican, has been working on a draft that makes technical changes to the existing Communications Act and also incorporates a number of bipartisan measures focused on agency efficiency, transparency, public safety. The discussion draft before us today updates the Commission's application and regulatory fee structure, requires the Commission to adopt rules governing agency process, and establishes the independence of the agency's Inspector General. While the draft incorporates many important reforms, we will continue having discussions with members of this committee about the inclusion of additional measures before consideration of the full committee. I look forward to the discussion and to advancing this legislation. And at this time, Mr. Pallone, I will recognize you for 3 minutes for an opening.
Thank you, Chairman Blackburn. I know that reauthorizing the Federal Communications Commission has been a top priority for you, and I appreciate you've been open to working with us on it, and the legislation before us today is better as a result of that bipartisan work. For instance, the manager's amendment includes a bill from Congressman Welch and Young to improve call quality for those living in rural America. It includes the Rural Wireless Access Act from Congressman Loebsack and Costello that will help ensure the FCC is supporting wireless internet access more efficiently. We've also been able to incorporate the Improving Broadband Access for Vets Act from Congressman McNerney and Kinzinger to ensure that the FCC is doing all it can to get our veterans online. The reauthorization bill also includes Congresswoman Eshu's Response Act to help first responders find someone when they call 911, and Congressman Engel's bill that makes sure our network operators have more relevant cyber threat information. This work is a good start, but we still have critical work to do before I can support reporting this bill out of the full committee. We must find a way to include the Viewer Protection Act in any final FCC reauthorization bill. A number of Democrats have put forward a bill that would make sure that television viewers or radio listeners will not lose signal as a result of the FCC's incentive auction. And as we've seen repeatedly over the past few months, disasters can strike at any time. And when they do, TV and radio broadcasters play a vital role in providing potentially life-saving information. For instance, right now in Puerto Rico, some broadcasters have managed to keep their signal going. They're reaching out to the desperate and telling them where to find the very limited resources needed for survival. And we cannot let these stations go dark. Unfortunately, funding the repacking of stations is not enough. People still need to know how to find the new signal. Currently, the FCC does not have any funding to educate people about how to reprogram their televisions. So my priority going forward will be to include sufficient funds to educate consumers on how to make sure their televisions still work. So as we begin this markup, I urge my colleagues to support the manager's amendment, but I also want to make clear that the bill should not proceed to a full committee markup until we find a way to include the Viewer Protection Act. And Madam Chairman, I just also wanted to state I was very disturbed to see this morning the President issue a tweet that seemed to threaten broadcasters' licenses only because he disagreed with their reporting. This threat alone could intimidate the press and lead to skewed and unfair reporting. And so therefore, I'm calling on the FCC Chairman, Pai, to immediately condemn this unwarranted attack. I also call on him to announce publicly that he will not follow through on his orders from the President. Chairman Pai should not act in any way to undermine free speech or our airwaves. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, Chairman Walden, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. Today, we take a positive step forward in our efforts to modernize America's outdated communications laws by reauthorizing the Federal Communications Commission, a task that's not been completed since 1990. Without a doubt, much has changed since the last reauthorization of the Commission. The last time this agency was authorized, we were still a year away from the first ever website, and cell phones could do little more than make a phone call. Now we all carry supercomputers in our pockets and rely heavily on forms of media that didn't even exist when the agency was last authorized. Our communications laws continue to lag behind, one of the many reasons this committee has prioritized a return to regular order and to reauthorizing agencies within our jurisdiction. The discussion draft before us today makes some important changes to the Commission's fee collection authority and includes a number of process reforms that will maximize the agency's transparency and efficiency. The draft also includes a number of bipartisan measures, including provisions that enhance public safety, ensure call reliability, and improve broadband coverage data collection. While this draft incorporates many important technical amendments and policy changes, there are still issues before this committee that need to be addressed. For example, last month, we held a hearing on the broadcaster repacking process and heard about the challenges associated with completing the process on time and on budget. We hope to have further discussion on these issues between now and the time this draft is considered by the full committee. We share in the effort to try and make sure that broadcasters are appropriately taken care of as the band gets repacked. If we'd only kept the number in there of $3 billion I had when we started the process, maybe we wouldn't be facing the challenge we are today. But we got a lot of pushback on that. I want to thank the subcommittee colleagues for engaging on these issues. It's an important piece of our work, and as you know, we're going through agency by agency, program by program, and doing our authorizing work, which is really important for the committee and the Congress and the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Doyle, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, and Madam Chair, I want to thank you for holding this markup and also for working with us to advance this legislation on a bipartisan basis. This bill represents a good start and a good faith effort by the majority to work with us. My hope is that we can further improve this bill before we bring it before the full committee. I'm proud that we were able to work with the majority to include a number of bipartisan and Democratic initiatives in this bill. These are sensible policy measures that serve to make sensible and targeted improvements to the law and people's lives. The majority has rightly seen fit to include language from Chairman Walden's FCC process reform bill that we have now passed through the House twice. This bill includes Ms. Eshu's FCC Collaboration Act, which I and Mr. Shimkus were original co-sponsors of in the 113th and 14th Congress. We were also able to include a number of bipartisan and Democratic measures from a number of our members, including Mr. McNerney and Mr. Kinzinger's bill to promote broadband internet access for veterans, and a bill from Mr. Loebsack and Mr. Costello to improve the SEC's collection of wireless coverage data, as well as a bill from Ms. Eshu directing the FCC to take action on 911 call location accuracy, and a bill from Mr. Engel, the creation of an interagency advisory committee to examine and report on communications security. Despite all of this good, I still think we have some issues left to be addressed before we get to full committee. Foremost among them is addressing the shortfall in the Broadcaster Relocation Fund. Ranking Member Pallone has put forth his Viewer Protection Act, which I and many of my colleagues support. We need to act to correct the current shortfall in funding and ensure that consumers are not harmed because Congress failed to account for the cost of broadcasters' relocation. It's critical that we not only fund the relocation itself, but consumer education about the transition as well. One of the key lessons of the DTV transition was that the success of the transition hinged on educated and informed consumers. It's essential that we can include these provisions as a part of the final package by the time we reach full committee. And one last thing, I do appreciate the bipartisan work that we're doing here today, but like Mr. Pallone, I am deeply concerned by a tweet that the President sent out this morning. The President threatened NBC and other networks with loss of their broadcast licenses for the reporting on his administration. While it is certainly the administration's right to dispute the veracity of reporting done by the media, it is unacceptable for the President and the administration to threaten the independence of the media when they don't like the reporting. With that, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Guthrie, you are recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman Blackburn. I support the work of the committee to reauthorize the FCC. The technology we're talking about today compared to that to 1990 is astounding, and especially with the explosion of wireless technology. Getting more spectrum into the pipeline for commercial use is a top priority of mine as we think about more ways to continue work with the Commission. And as the Chairman knows, under your leadership, my good friend Congresswoman Matsui and I have been working hard to bring more spectrum to market and to spur efficiency in existing uses. So I wanted to thank the Chairman for your statement today that you support continuing the conversation about spectrum, which will be important to give the FCC the tools they need to make more spectrum available. And as leaders of the Spectrum Caucus, we're already working with stakeholders to identify bands that may be right for commercialization. So we look forward to continuing to work with you in this effort as well. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Lopsack for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment includes legislation I introduced, the Rural Wireless Access Act, to make sure we're getting wireless coverage throughout rural America. I'm constantly driving through the 24 counties in my district in Iowa, and I can tell you there are a lot of areas where you cannot get a signal. But right now, the maps the FCC is using to figure out where to invest resources tells a different story. That somehow, lo and behold, all of Iowa is getting high-speed 4G LTE wireless coverage. You can ask me or you can ask any of my constituents, and we'll tell you that that is simply not the case. My bill would fix this issue and make sure the FCC is using accurate data so that our coverage maps are accurate and investments are going to the areas that need them most. And I want to thank in particular Congressman Costello for working on a bipartisan basis on this. And Madam Chair, I appreciate your incorporating this into the larger bill. And I'm looking forward to reporting this out of committee, and hopefully we'll get out of the bigger committee, the full committee, and onto the floor and get it passed. Thanks so much.
Absolutely, and you deserve that credit for being so persistent on this issue. Mr. Flores, you're recognized.
Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing to reauthorize the FCC. As we've heard several times already this afternoon, it's been almost 27 years since we last reauthorized the Commission. In that time, we've seen several technological advances that stayed light years ahead of the policy debates here in Washington, from mobile tablets and phones to virtual reality and now driverless cars. Looking forward, I hope that we will focus on providing encouragement for the deployment of 5G, continue efforts to revitalize AM radio, and to ensure smooth transitions by all of those affected by the incentive auction. And you've heard this conversation many times with respect to the incentive auction. Speaking of that auction, the underlying bill's provisions that would be used to reimburse TV stations inadvertently left out many radio broadcasters that utilize similar infrastructure and would be similarly impacted. As we look forward to the solutions on the repack of the TV spectrum, I hope to work with the committee on consideration of my bill, the Radio Consumer Protection Act. The bill has a narrow way to address the reimbursements by adding radios and prevents the oversight of many of our radio stations and listeners from being left out of a process that they really don't even benefit from at all. I thank you for the opportunity to work towards modernizing FCC and for the time to speak today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Matsui, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased that we're coming together today in a bipartisan manner to reauthorize the Federal Communications Commission. The issues facing the Commission are critical to the advancement of our digital economy and to our country's prosperity. I hope to continue to work with the committee on other important priorities as well. As Ranking Member Pallone mentioned, we need to ensure that our local broadcasters have the resources they need to transition following our successful incentive auction. That auction was a result of diligent bipartisan work between the committee and federal agencies to find creative solutions to free up spectrum. Spectrum is a finite resource. With the possibility of 5G on the horizon, there's no doubt that the spectrum will be critical to achieving a robust national network that reaches all Americans. That is why I joined Representative Guthrie in introducing the Federal Spectrum Incentive Act to provide financial incentives for federal agencies to relinquish any unused spectrum to be repurposed for commercial use. I look forward to continuing to work with the committee on this legislation and other spectrum initiatives. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any other members seeking time? You're recognized, Mr.
Well, I thank the chairwoman for her work on this and diligent work in the committee. I'm glad that we're able to come together to a bipartisan agreement on reauthorizing the FCC. The amendment in the nature of substitute being offered today includes a bipartisan bill that Congressman Kinzinger and I introduced. The provision will set us on a path of working to close the digital divide for veterans. Having broadband internet connection helps veterans to apply for jobs. It helps them obtain vocational training. It helps them communicate with friends and family and have access to Veterans Administration services. My provision directs the FCC to examine the current state of broadband access and what can be done to increase that access. It asks the Commission to focus on low-income veterans and veterans residing in rural areas, both of which face a higher likelihood of not having broadband internet service. This measure was passed in the House last year with overwhelming support. I thank the chairs and ranking members for working with me and with Mr. Kinzinger to include this language in the amendment before us today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There being no other members wishing to give a 1-minute opening. Oh, we have one more. Oh, Ms. Eshoo, I'm so sorry. Didn't see you. You're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm glad that we've come together to reauthorize the FCC, something Congress hasn't accomplished since 1991. So today is an important day. And I want to thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and your staff for working with us to include a number of important priorities in this bill. The reauthorization includes legislation I introduced last Congress, the Response Act, requiring the FCC to complete a proceeding within 18 months to ensure that all 911 calls, including those made using a multi-line telephone system, provide the precise location of a 911 caller to first responders. We know that when someone calls 911, first responders have to know exactly where an individual is calling from, especially if the caller is unable to communicate to the dispatcher or the caller simply doesn't know where they are. This is an issue the FCC has been studying since 1994, and it's a priority that John Shimkus and I, the founders of the NG 911 caucus, have been working on for a long time. I want to thank Chairman Walden, who committed to working with me to ensure that the FCC completed a proceeding on location accuracy, and he's kept his promise, and that is included in this bill. And just one more thing, the FCC Collaboration Act. I don't know how many Congresses I've introduced that in. It's the Sunshine Law. And that's also included, so maybe this is the magic year for that. So thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Let's hope that it is the magic year for getting some of these things across the finish line. You're recognized, Mr. Ruiz. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairwoman. First, I want to thank you, Chairwoman Blackburn, for your commitment to working on this important reauthorization in a bipartisan manner. Together, we have many ideas that will improve reliability, access, and security, and we truly work best when we work together. I filed several amendments to the bill today that I believe can receive bipartisan support and will further improve this bill, and I appreciate your commitment to working to making sure that we include some of these afterwards. The first, which is based on my bill, H.R. 1581, the Tribal Digital Access Act, would help close the digital divide through Indian country by codifying and reinforcing the importance of FCC programs through the Universal Service Fund that tribal communities can use. Your staff have been working with my office in a good faith manner to refine the bill and secure the support of the Commission, and I thank them for their hard work as well. Please relay that to your staff, Chairwoman. I hope we can continue to work together so that this legislation may be included when this bill is considered in the full committee. The next amendment would call on the FCC to study and publish a set of best practices for wireless operators to consider as they rebuild and as they build for a future with more and more severe storms. So hurricane kind of resiliency for some of these infrastructure developments that we need. And finally, the last amendment would ensure tribal representation on the FCC Federal-State Joint Board on Universal Services. So in closing, thank you very much. I look forward to making sure that the tribes have a voice at the table at all times. Thank you.
The gentleman yells back, and now, at this point, the chair will call up the discussion draft and ask the clerk to report.
Discussion draft to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to reauthorize appropriations for the Federal Communications Commission, to provide for certain procedural changes to the rules of the Commission, to maximize opportunities for public participation and efficient decision-making, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. The chair now recognizes herself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the discussion draft offered by Mrs. Blackburn.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the chair recognizes herself in support of the amendment. And I can assure you all we will go quickly because we have about 8 minutes left, 7 minutes left now. And this is a bipartisan amendment. It demonstrates the willingness of both parties to come together in agreement on important policy issues. And I do thank all members of the subcommittee and their staffs for their engagement. This amendment builds upon existing bipartisan legislation addressing process reforms that the House passed earlier this year. These process reforms ensure the FCC continues to improve its efficiency and transparency. It includes a number of additions aimed at improving communications reliability and public safety. The Sandy Act, which requires the FCC to conduct a study on the feasibility and benefits of making Wi-Fi access points available to the general public for access to 911 services during times of emergency. It also includes Kerry's Law, another bipartisan bill aimed to add access to 911 services. In addition to process reforms, the amendment recognizes the importance of cybersecurity in carrying out the FCC's mission, elevates the role of the Chief Information Officer. Specifically, the CIO now has a significant role in the decision-making process for planning, programming, and budgeting. This amendment also incorporates the bipartisan work of Mr. Loebsack and Mr. Costello to bring wireless coverage to rural areas. The Rural Wireless Act takes a big step in the right direction. We have the FCC Consolidated Reporting Act, the Amateur Radio Parity Act, the Anti-Spoofing Act, the Improving Rural Call Quality Act. These are all measures that the committee has previously considered and have passed the House on a bipartisan basis. We're going to continue working to incorporate additional provisions before consideration of the full committee, including measures on spectrum and regulatory relief, and I look forward to advancing the legislation to the full committee, and I thank my colleagues for their support. Are there others wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Latta, you are recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I support the committee's efforts to reauthorize the Federal Communication Commission. However, I believe an important provision is missing. H.R. 3787, the Small Entity Regulatory Relief Opportunity Act, CIRL. I introduced this legislation along with Mr. Schrader to help alleviate small businesses from burdensome regulations. The telecommunications and technology sector is known for innovation and startups, and small companies generate much of this creativity. These smaller businesses do not require the same level of regulatory oversight as large entities. In fact, heavy-handed regulations often hinder small entities, which both Congress and the FCC have previously recognized. Our legislation would offer relief to permit small entities to grow, innovate, and hire new employees by streamlining and expediting the FCC's existing waiver process. Directing the FCC to streamline procedures will benefit small businesses and their customers, providing greater certainty, fewer costs, and administrative efficiency. CERO would also require the FCC to offer small entities with a one-year deferral on new regulations, with some exceptions. Additionally, the FCC, as part of its triennial review, would review existing regulations applicable to small entities and determine if any relief should be granted. This common sense proposal is a common sense proposal. Small businesses are the engines of our economy, creating 2 out of every 3 jobs. Our focus should be to ensure that we are creating a regulatory environment that encourages innovation, spurs competition, and fosters consumer choice. Again, I would ask the chair that we could work together on including Mr. Schrader's and my proposal in the underlying bill before it comes to a full markup and the full committee markup. I thank the chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and yes, we will continue to work on this issue, and we appreciate you bringing it to the committee's attention. Are there others seeking to speak on the amendment? Are there any other amendments, bipartisan amendments? Nope. No. Mr. Doyle is ready to roll. Yeah, I hear it. And I can just draw this out all day long if I wanted to, right? If there is no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding the discussion draft to the full committee as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to.
Well done, Madam Chair.
If there is, okay. With that, we will, at this time, no. Okay. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today, so ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.